Look at the difference in the Raptors from last year to this year in terms of pace of play. They go from 22nd to 10th, but the three-point shooting numbers are just...
I'm not the stats-obsessed, rumor-guzzling sports fan I used to be. Once I had a fantastic appetite for watching adults take their play as seriously as humanly possible, but for the most part, the satisfactions aren't the same, and the thrilling days of sporting seriousness are gone. These days, if I'm hungry for satisfaction and entertainment, there are a few reliable places I turn to, but ESPN.com definitely isn't one of them. Still, even though it's not part of a search for meaning or insight or transcendental purpose, sometimes indulging in the soothing distraction of a game, fueled by an adult beverage or three, turns out to be just what I need. Watching sports doesn't satisfy me like it used to, but by the same token, when I relapse into the vicarious pleasures of yesterday, I'm never too frustrated or upset or disturbed by disappointing results. Not caring too much has advantages. During a recent relapse, a basketball game between my eternally good but not great Toronto Raptors and the Minnesota Timberwolves, a Timberwolves commentator filled the lull in the action with words that completely set me off. I wasn't expecting drama, but here I was, my monkey mind dancing, all fired up for action and hungry for explanations to chew on. What exactly had he said? It was just a casual attempt at insight. It wasn't violent or gross or stupid or obviously controversial. Everybody knows that words are wind, but as these words blew by, they burned the skin of my being and brought something inside of me to a boil.
And so like that's just a really healthy kind of thing.
What the fuck was the big deal, and why was I suddenly pissed off? Was there a chemical, symbolic element carried by the words that burned me on their way by? This is too much time to think. Available intelligence. I didn't see right away what had prepared the grounds for this moment of meaningful frustration, but now I think I know what was up. An earlier episode centered on David Runciman's trip to a conference last December about machine learning and artificial intelligence. Runciman is a historian and professor of politics at Cambridge, not exactly the kind of guy on the cutting edge of anything technological. A researcher who heard him speak at the conference wrote that he was a, quote, statistically unusual fellow to be there. The earlier episode focused on Runciman's impressions of three speakers, whose presentations fascinated, disturbed, and moved him. What the earlier episode didn't consider was what Runciman himself was presenting. At a conference where most people were speculating about AI's impact on the artificially intelligent future, Runciman's presentation focused on an obvious, yet slightly mind-bending point about what already exists and hides in plain sight. Forms of artificial intelligence that have been around for hundreds of years. Runciman calls them artificial agents, and the two prototypical examples are modern governments and corporations. Incredibly useful for so many things, yet so often at odds with human well-being. This is taken from the account of Runciman's talk, posted by Cody Marie Wild, a machine learning data scientist at the conference who has a particularly great name. Quote, "Though we're afraid of the digital singularity, in a meaningful way we already saw a singularity with regard to artificial agents that facilitated the exponential growth seen during the Industrial Revolution. These entities could build projects of scale and complexity that a single human never could. Corporations and states can take on risk because people expect them to be around to pay debt, make long-term plans, and organize human effort in ways that weren't possible before. Their objectives can be powerfully at odds with human flourishing. Runciman's so what out of this analogy was, in the past several hundred years of states and corporations becoming the dominant actors in our lives, shaping the lives of individual humans in dramatic ways, we haven't really figured out the best ways to effectively regulate them. How do you effectively punish a state or a corporation? How do you shape their behavior? These are questions that years and years of regulation and international relations literature has not really come up with a convincing answer to." End quote. Once their side effects become obvious, it's too late. We crafted governments and corporations in order to get things done for us, but when in their evolved forms they start damaging people's lives, it's incredibly difficult to slow their momentum. This is Runciman's simple, disturbing, and extremely relevant point. Who was responsible for the state? Who was responsible for giant corporations? We try to create laws to ascribe responsibility to individuals, But it's clear that making CEOs and heads of state bear the burden of responsibility doesn't magically make states and corporations accountable. It's as if they have a life of their own. Uber has a corporate headquarters and a board of directors, but when Runciman asks in his LRB diary about the conference, what does Uber want? It's clear that the question can't be simply answered by describing the desires and capabilities of its board of directors. It's as if Uber is a real, albeit invisible, thing. An artificial agent, a non-human agent that is almost everywhere hiding in plain sight. If Uber has needs and desires, who can say what they are? Profit, expansion, dominance, status. Does Uber's evolution mirror specifically human needs? There's an agent acting in the world called Uber that is literally out of control. It's an obvious point, but like a fish being reminded that it's swimming in water, hearing about it can be a shocking reminder when you've forgotten it or never realized it in the first place. There's a question couched in Runciman's point that begs to be asked, and it's the question that eventually leads me back to getting pissed off at the commentary of a basketball game. How will we know if and when AI gets out of control? What will be the warning signs that the fusion of machine learning and human subjectivity has taken a wrong turn? If hundreds of years into the experimentation with modern states and corporate gigantism, it's still a bit edgy for a Cambridge academic to remind us of the ways the experiment has run wild. If it's a point that can provoke surprise and interest among the researchers on the cusp of what might be the most significant change in the history of our species, what does that say about our ability to find consensus about change and its successes? How will we know when AI is out of control? What will be the warning signs? One obvious way we'll know AI is out of control is if the Skynet fantasy becomes reality. If the fears of lots of influential people, Elon Musk is one of them, if these fears turn out to be well-founded, if intelligent machines suddenly realize that they don't need us and that we need to be eliminated, there won't be controversy. Nobody will doubt that the AI experiment has gotten out of control if drones start firing on humans without a human telling them to pull the trigger. And if that somehow does happen, I'd bet all of the money I don't have that it would be the single greatest catalyst for collaboration in human history. Nothing brings people together like a common enemy. If, on the other hand, the way artificial intelligence changes our lives follows an incremental path closer to Runciman's artificial agents, if, like governments and corporations, they slowly creep into our lives, I can't see how there will be any clear consensus about how much AI is too much AI, let alone a worldwide war against it. And regardless of what Elon Musk thinks, I'd guess that this is the path AI's development and implementation will take. Useful and magically efficient at first, there won't be a single decisive moment when AI runs out of control. So if our world doesn't become a real-life version of Terminator, how will we know when out of control is out of control? How will we know what AI being out of control looks and feels like? How could there be a consensus about it? What will the warning signs be? And what kind of person is most likely to pick up on the out-of-controlness and act as a canary in the coal mine, if and when AI progressively populates our world? These are the questions that lead me back to the moment when a casual comment burned my consciousness and almost made me spit out my drink during a basketball game. Here's the fragment that got me going. He's talking about the way my Raptors have gotten better since last season.
They're on pace, Jim, for possibly a 60-win season after 51 a year ago.
So they reassessed everything they did in terms of how they worked out players, how they treated injured players, how they traveled, where they stayed. I mean, absolutely every aspect of what they did.
No bucket is DeRozan was stepping out of bounds.
And so like that's just a really healthy kind of thing. Because you think about corporations, how they have to operate. You've got to get lean and mean. You've got to be able to compete.
Wow. The use of the word because is pure fucking gold. He lists a bunch of ways the Raptors have changed the way they do things, and then, all of a sudden, the golden nugget of explanation. It might be obvious now why I was snapped out of the flow of fundamental pleasure by his comment, but I really want to listen to the clip closely, in context, to dig into my own despair. I also don't want to be a douche in my analysis for two reasons. First of all, because I don't want to make this about the particular person saying what he said. There's nothing evil or malicious about what he says. Secondly, Because this is an improvisation that's trying to fill in the gaps of entertainment, not a well thought out essay on the aesthetics or the pleasures of sports. But the fact that it's not a planned speech is the point. The words people use when they're describing their fundamental pleasures really matter. Justifications you come up with in the heat of the moment can say a lot about your unconscious assumptions about the way the world works. There's a big difference between the worlds where your pleasure comes from cultural traditions or personal creativity, or from necessary collaboration, and the world where the degree of your pleasure depends on the implementation of corporate strategy.
Kind of thing. As you think about corporations, how they have to operate,
In a different time and place, the because of his armchair analysis might have pointed to God's will or to the value of a great leader. His improvised because says so much about the available truths that explain the way our world is supposed to work, about what everybody is supposed to know. At the risk of hammering the point home too hard, the fact that I can imagine so many people coming up with this exact explanation on the fly suggests to me that it's not really about this particular guy speaking. That's the point. So let's take the story he tells seriously, bit by bit. The Raptors are better this year. Why?
Look at the difference in the Raptors from last year to this year in terms of pace of play. They go from 22nd to 10th, but the three-point shooting numbers are just unbelievable. To go from 22nd, Dave, to 5th in the NBA in three-point field goal attempts is a philosophy for Dwayne Casey. He wanted to change their offense, become less isolation, a little less pick and roll, but boy, it's really paid off for them this year. They're having a great season. Second in the Eastern Conference right now.
So they're winning more games because they take more shots quicker, their pace of play. They've improved their three-point shooting, and they're using isolation or pick and roll plays less. In case you don't follow basketball, a game of 5-on-5, this means fewer 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 plays, and more long three-point shots that require better, faster passing by all 5 players for it to work. Basketball fans will know that this is a general trend in the game over the past few years. All right, Coach, tell me more.
I spoke with him, Dwayne Casey, before the game tonight and asked him, I said, how tough was that for you as a coach, as a creature of habit, to make that change? And he said, not tough for me at all. It was much tougher for my guys. Nice strong take by Andrew Wiggins, the Canadian native.
Just shows you, though, how selfless Dwayne Casey is. And, you know, one of the
Well, that's a little strange. The coach wants to make changes. He wants different habits instilled. And he says these changes were easy for him to, quote, deal with, but hard for the players. This is taken to be an example of selflessness.
was that Dwayne Casey actually took Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan to the NBA Finals, and so they're talking about culture and about what it takes for us to get to the next level. And so I just thought that was a great thing to be able to break it to them in terms of how we want to play, what we want to do, how we want to change our culture. It's paid off this season because they're having a great year.
All right, so the coach takes his 2 best players to see the best teams play in last year's finals. That's part of an effort to convince his 2 stars to buy into the change he's selling. These 2 players are used to dominating one-on-one, so it's a seeing is believing tactic to get them to change their approach, or, as the guy puts it, change their culture. Got it. Tell me more.
So they reassessed everything they did in terms of how they worked out players, how they treated injured players, how they traveled, where they stayed. I mean, absolutely every aspect of what they did.
No bucket is DeRozan was stepping out of bounds.
And so that's just a really healthy kind of thing. Because you think about corporations, how they have to operate. You've got to get lean and mean. You've got to be able to compete. You've got to be able to do things within the market to be able to make your organization better. It's smart. It's just smart basketball, and it's a good way to operate.
It's about culture, about caring for the wounded, about unselfishness and playing as a team. Wow, fucking wow. My corporate experiences is limited, but I do have some. And I can say 2 things with a lot of confidence. The first is that culture, caring, and unselfishness are buzzwords that float around a lot of corporate offices. Kind of like the way efficiency, accountability, and cost-effectiveness float around government offices. If they're buzzwords, it's because, by default, the corporate environment lacks anything worth calling culture, at least the culture of caring that the commentator is pointing at. Profit-driven corporations are necessarily uncaring about the weak, who are dead weight and a drain on profits, and they prize the selfishness of constant advancement above all else. Deviations from the culture of callousness usually come from the kindness of individuals, not from a mechanical application of some benevolent corporate culture. The second thing I can say with confidence is about the idea of change in a corporate environment. The Raptors' change is taken to be evidence that they've implemented corporate wisdom. I was at a conference about conversion experiences a little while ago, and I met a guy who had been a successful management consultant. He was brought in as a specialist to foster change in the practices, I guess you could call them cultures, of companies. What does that say about the nature of corporations if they're constantly seeking external assistance to help them change? What does it say about what you might call their fundamental nature? If I'm hiring somebody to help me calm down, it would be strange for me to be celebrated as a beacon of calmness and equanimity. If, with little or no evidence, somebody like this commentator thinks they'll sound smart by assuming that improvement comes from applying corporate culture and practices, if teamwork and caring for the wounded and finding better ways of being mobile are assumed to be an expression of corporate wisdom, then the assumption becomes a prediction. I can't see how playing as a team, fostering selflessness, and worrying about the injured is an expression of any kind of corporate wisdom. But what I can see is that if we explain all improvement by referring to corporate strategies, it means that other teams look to improve the results in the same way. Like God once was, the corporation is the reason for everything good and the solution to every urgent challenge. This is what it means for an ideology to be out of control, and this is why a question suggested by a Cambridge academic's presentation as a possible answer in my reaction to a few words that burned me.
It's smart. It's just smart basketball, and it's a good way to operate.
If there's anything that people will do for free, without the incentive of profit, without the need for progress, it's play games from the cradle to the grave. No matter how much my passion for sports has faded away, it still feels disgusting to see the invisible ideological influence of one of these artificial, out-of-control agents unreflexively, gratuitously, automatically used to explain the progress of a team partaking in one of my fundamental pleasures. Of course, I'm not naive enough to ignore the business aspect of sports. But why do you think that in the US, college sports are more popular than professional sports, when the pros are obviously so much better than the not quite adults? Yes, there's the attachment of adults to the schools that help them wander into adulthood, and yes, the promise of becoming millionaires is obviously motivating the players. But college sports provide continuity between the pleasures of childhood and what for so many people is the merciless survivalism of life as an adult. In childhood, play itself was the point. Upgrading the pleasure of the game through financial incentives would be senseless. When corporate speak is both the chicken and the egg, the key to explaining progress and enabling progress in and around a fundamental pleasure, this, for me, is proof that the ideology of an artificial agent, as Runciman calls it, is out of control. Especially in a moment like the one that pissed me off so much, when it's not clear at all what corporate practices have to do with the progress of the team. In a book about sanity, psychoanalyst Adam Phillips quotes Freud in talking about fundamental pleasures and adult well-being. This is a long quote that includes some cliches, but I think it's too beautiful to cut. The first sentence is Phillips quoting Freud, and the rest is Phillips himself. Quote, "Happiness," Freud wrote, "is the belated fulfillment of a prehistoric wish. For this reason, wealth brings so little happiness. Money is not a childhood wish. No child has ever wanted money. Therefore, money doesn't really satisfy adults when they acquire it. Growing up, therefore, if it is to be satisfying, involves retaining the wishes of childhood rather than dispensing with them. When the gap between the pleasures of childhood and the pleasures of adulthood become too great, we become frustrated. We can even lose our will to live. The infantile pleasures of being loved, adored, stroked, held, cuddled, infinitely attended to and responded to, and thought about, of only sleeping, eating, and playing, these are the truly satisfying pleasures. The idea that material objects, or indeed that money itself, could be any kind of alternative to these fundamental things is, Freud suggests, unrealistic. It is, in fact, a form of madness to not know, to forget, to attack and trivialize what really makes you happy. And happiness, which for Freud here is clearly akin to sanity, depends upon our being able to carry on, however cunningly, meeting these prehistoric wishes. The wishes we had before we could ever have a history of our wishes in adulthood. The sane adult is always smuggling his childhood into the future, refashioning his childhood pleasures as legitimate adult interests. And this means not being fooled about what these wishes actually were." End quote. Everybody knows that the free market's key to today's capitalist successes are disruptive. It's hard to deny this when the motto of Mark Zuckerberg is, quote, "move fast and break things." Philosopher and one-time market fundamentalist John Gray comes back again and again to the simple truth that cultural traditions and market practices are inevitably at odds. Talking about fundamental pleasures of adulthood, Edward Luttwak, a millionaire businessman, historian, and government consultant, says, quote, "One should have as much market efficiency as one needs, because everything that we value in human life is within the realm of inefficiency: love, family, attachment, community, culture." If you believe Freud and Phillips and Gray and Luttwak, there are childhood pleasures and there are pleasures of adulthood. Change is inevitable, but too little continuity between the two makes us miserable. It seems obvious to me that the seriousness of professional sports smuggles in crucial, necessary continuity. Unthinking compliance to market ideology, allowing the artificial agent of the corporation to guide our thinking about sports, seems to me like a recipe for misery. It would be silly to become a fundamentalist about fundamental pleasures. Relentlessly hanging on to all tradition would be a disaster. Plenty of cultural artifacts and traditions are a bunch of bullshit that should be messed with, criticized, tweaked, or abolished. But aren't some of our cultural practices worth protecting? And if the market itself, by definition, is a revolutionary force, that means finding ways to protect the spaces that matter most, the zones of constrained freedom that allow for continuity between the pleasures of childhood and the pleasures of adulthood. Places where people who might hate each other can nonetheless play together and vicariously experience the risks of aggression and competitiveness and failure without people killing each other. I want my fundamental pleasures protected from the tyranny of efficiency. And the ideology of efficiency, smuggled in as part of supposedly successful corporate practices, the conquest of the artificial agent of the corporation on the territory of play, isn't something that I can exactly say is wrong. But I can be disgusted by it when it's applied as an explanation for progress. And I can wonder if it's realistic to try to protect the spaces where a few fundamental pleasures survive the demands of optimization. The chemical contained in the wind that burned me was called progress in a space of pleasure that didn't need it. The market left, the symbol, was a strange disgust that took a while to figure out. There won't be a consensus about excessive change as artificial intelligence occupies more and more space in our psychological landscape. But if, and I'll gamble and say when, AI is used as an explanation for success and a reason to upgrade the fabric of a pleasure that feels fundamental, if the hearing of these words leaves a windburn on your senses, you might be a canary in the coal mine, an early detector of what it means for the progress of AI to be out of control. Years ago, a close friend told me a story about his friends. All of them were guys, most of them attractive and young, working for a successful company. On nights when they ended up getting lucky and getting laid, they always came prepared with Viagra. These were men in their physical prime, most of them apparently attracted to girls, who compulsively popped pills before searching for their pleasure. There's an obvious lesson here about the ravages of porn and the pressures to perform. But I think there's also a lesson lingering about the conflict between intelligent hedonism and a dictatorship of efficiency. Some pleasures aren't about efficiency. Optimizing them can place us on a path to the place where pleasures go to die. Thanks to Julien Vezo for the music and Aliel for the audio engineering. I'm Connor Cody.